Brighton seafront, a Saturday evening in July 1936. Ivy Marchant, 26, a shop assistant from Bermondsey, is standing on the promenade opposite the Palace Pier in a dress she pressed the night before. She came down on the 4:12 from Victoria. Third class, 2 hours wages for the return ticket, and she has exactly one evening before the last train back at 11:05. She is not walking toward anything. She is walking the way people walk when the walking is the entire point. Past the shelters, past the deck chair rows being folded up for the night, past a family from Streatham arguing pleasantly about whether there is time for the pier before the tide turns the light gray. Ivy has done this 7 Saturdays this summer. She could not have told you, if you'd asked her on the platform at Victoria, what she was coming down for. The sea was visible from the train at Preston Park. That was not it. What was it, then, that a shop girl from Bermondsey was buying with 2 hours of her wages and a 5-hour round trip? And why did it have to be Brighton, and not the river 2 streets from her own front door? Before you can understand what Ivy Marchant was doing on that promenade, you need to understand what a day trip resort actually was, because Brighton was never what Blackpool was. Blackpool organized itself around the Wakes Week, a whole Lancashire mill town arriving for a fortnight and staying in the same boarding house year after year. Brighton organized itself around the return half of a ticket. The railway had reached the town in 1841, and by the time Ivy was making her Saturday trips, Brighton had spent nearly a century perfecting a single specialized function, taking London's working population out of London for an evening or a day and returning them before Monday. There was no bucket and spade fortnight to save for. There was a fare, a few hours, and a very specific evening choreography. The walk down from the station, the promenade before dark, the pier if there was time and money, the walk back for the last train. Brighton's whole social machinery was tuned to that unit of time, the shelters, the deck chair rows charged by the hour rather than the week, the pier turnstiles designed for a crowd that came and went in a single evening rather than settling in for a fortnight. None of it was accidental. It was Brighton's answer to a London clerk's or shop assistant's actual budget, not 2 weeks' wages and a boarding house room booked in November, but one evening's fare and the nerve to spend it on nothing but walking. What, then, did that walk actually have to buy? And what did it cost a person like Ivy, in a city built for the fortnight and boarding house economy of the North, to be someone whose whole holiday was a single evening? Here is the detail Brighton's own history keeps in plain sight and rarely explains. The town built 2 piers within 35 years of each other, and they were not competing for the same evening. The West Pier opened in 1866, designed by Eugenius Birch, the most sought-after pier engineer of the Victorian era, an open promenade structure with ornamental Oriental-style kiosks, glass windscreens, and from 1875 a bandstand, built for a slower, more expensive kind of strolling. It courted the visitor who had come to be seen walking, not to be entertained. The Palace Pier, what most people simply call Brighton Pier today, opened in 1899 and was finished by 1901. Built explicitly to catch the day tripper trade, the West Pier had never fully chased. The theater, the amusement arcades, the funfair rides, the deliberately noisier, cheaper, faster architecture of a crowd that had a few hours and wanted value for every one of them. The 2 piers stood less than half a mile apart and sorted Brighton's visitors almost as effectively as a locked door. Ivy Marchant, on her single evening's budget, was always going to end up walking toward the Palace Pier's lit entrance rather than the West Pier's quieter colonnade. Not because anyone told her she couldn't afford the other one, but because everything about where the queues formed, what the tickets cost, and what the evening was built to deliver had already decided it for her before she left Bermondsey. If this is the kind of history you came here for, not old postcards of piers, but what the piers were actually built to sort people by, this channel exists for exactly that. Every video takes one specific piece of the British seaside, a pier, a promenade, a railway service, a boarding house street, and follows what it actually organized for the people who used it, and who it left standing on the wrong platform. What did an evening on Brighton's Palace Pier give a London shop assistant in 1936 that a fortnight in a package holiday hotel 40 years later was never built to provide? If you or your family made this kind of trip, tell us where, which station, which pier, which train home. And there's more of this coming. The next video follows what happened to the Brighton Belle, the Pullman train built for exactly this evening, and why it stopped running in 1972. Back to the promenade. The train Ivy actually rode wasn't the famous one, and that gap matters. From 1908, the London Brighton and South Coast Railway ran the Southern Belle, an all-Pullman service that by 1933 became a fully electric train. Plush armchairs, inlaid woods, onboard dining, a 60-minute run from Victoria, renamed the Brighton Belle in June 1934 by the town's own mayor at a ceremony on the platform. It was built, deliberately, as the glamorous version of exactly the journey Ivy made every Saturday. London to Brighton and back, timed for an evening by the sea. But the Belle ran first class only for its first years, and even after third class was added, its fare sat well above an ordinary day excursion ticket. Ivy's 412 was an ordinary electric service, third class, packed with people making the identical trip for a fraction of the price and none of the pink lampshades. Two trains, same timetable slot, same destination, same idea of what a London evening by the sea was worth having, and two entirely different answers to who got to have it in comfort. That gap between the Belle and the ordinary excursion train is the whole class geography of Brighton itself, compressed into a single railway timetable. The same resort, arrived at differently, walked through differently, and left at a different hour because the last ordinary train home left earlier than the last Belle. What did it mean for a shop assistant timing her whole evening around a cheaper train's earlier last departure, to know that somewhere on the same line a Pullman car was still running, an hour behind her, full of people whose evening didn't have to end when hers did? Walk the same half-mile of Brighton Promenade in 1936, and the seawall itself sorts people before they've said a word to anyone. Nearer the Palace Pier, the crowd is louder, younger, closer together. Day trippers stretching a few hours as far as they'll go, buying rock and shrimp and turns on the machines, timing everything against a train home. Along the West Pier stretch and up toward Hove, the pace slows. The clothing is more formal. The strolling has nowhere it needs to be by 11 o'clock, because the people walking there mostly aren't catching a train back to London at all. They're staying in a Brighton or Hove hotel, or they live along the front. This wasn't signposted. Nobody put up a rope. It worked the way British seaside class geography usually worked. Through price, through pace, through which entertainments were built where, through the simple fact that a person budgeting a single evening's fare walks differently than a person who has booked a week. Ivy Marchant, on her evening off, would have felt this without being able to name it. The way the crowd around the Palace Pier felt like her own, and the way the quieter stretch toward Hove felt like somewhere she was passing through rather than somewhere she belonged, even though nothing stopped her physically from walking there. It is worth being honest, in the same breath, that Brighton in this period was overwhelmingly a resort by and for white-working and middle-class Londoners and Sussex residents. The documented history of Black British seaside access, the no vacancies practices recorded at boarding houses in resort towns through the 1950s and into the 1960s, and the protections that only began to arrive with the Race Relations Acts, belongs to this same promenade, even where Brighton's own day trip economy left fewer written boarding house records than Blackpool's did. The seawall sorted by class in ways everyone could feel and few could point to. It sorted by race in ways that were, at points, written on the front door. By the time Ivy Marchant might have queued for a Wednesday night show, the Palace Pier had been running theater entertainment continuously since before the First World War. It was a fully established variety venue by 1911, and it kept staging regular shows through the interwar years and into the post-war period, surviving wartime closures that most seafront entertainments faced. The theater's own life didn't end quietly. It was damaged in 1973 and eventually demolished in 1986, the moment the Pier's identity finally tipped away from stage entertainment toward the funfair and amusement arcade pier that exists today. But in the 1930s, that theater was still the evening's centerpiece for a day tripper with a few hours to spend. A comedian, a singer, a variety bill built to be digestible in one sitting by an audience that would never see the second half of the season and didn't need to, because they weren't coming back next Tuesday. That is a specific kind of show, built for strangers, not regulars, unlike the boarding house town pier theaters further north, where the same holidaymakers filled the same seats for the same fortnight every year, and the comedian could build a whole week's act around callbacks. Brighton's pier show had to work cold every single night on an audience it would never see twice. And the audience it was built to work cold for was assumed, almost without anyone writing it down, to be white and working or lower middle class London day trippers. The material, the references, the whole shape of the evening pitched at exactly the crowd getting off the third class trains. not at whoever else might have made the same journey and found the room, the door, or the material simply hadn't been built with them in the seats. The competing force that ended Ivy Marchant's kind of evening arrived from two directions at once, and neither of them was a Spanish package tour landing in Brighton specifically. Brighton's real vulnerability was to the private car and to changing London leisure habits, not to Thompson-style flights, because Brighton had never depended on a fortnight's booking the way Blackpool did. What it depended on was the railway's monopoly over a comfortable fast evening out, and that monopoly broke first. Private car ownership expanded through the 1950s and 1960s until a family with a car had no reason to time an entire evening around a train timetable at all. British Railways' own service rationalization under the Beeching-era cuts of the early 1960s thinned out branch and secondary services across the network, even where the Brighton main line itself survived. The damage was done to the wider web of connecting services that had once fed day trippers toward the coast from further afield. And the Brighton Belle itself, the glamorous Pullman that had defined what a first-class version of Ivy's evening looked like since 1933, made its final run on 30 April 1972, withdrawn as uneconomic in an era when the leisurely Pullman evening had simply stopped being what people wanted from a trip to the sea. 3 years later, in 1975, the West Pier closed on safety grounds and was never reopened, beginning the long decline that would end in the 2003 fires, and the skeletal ironwork still standing in the water today. The Palace Pier survived by doing what it had always done best, becoming louder, faster, more fairground, less theater, while the promenade itself, the free mile of walking that had never needed a ticket, simply kept being there for whoever still wanted an evening built around nothing but the sea and the walk toward it. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the British seaside actually organized for the people who used it, subscribe. There are more piers, more promenades, more evening trains, more class lines drawn in deck chair rows and box office queues than any single video can hold. What an evening on Brighton's Palace Pier gave a London shop assistant in 1936 was never really about the sea. She could see the sea from the train at Preston Park for nothing. It was about a single evening built entirely around not being at the counter, not being answerable to anyone, walking a mile with nowhere she had to be until the last train said otherwise. A fortnight in a Spanish apartment 40 years later could give her daughter guaranteed sun and a balcony and a swimming pool at the same price as a week in an English hotel. It was never built to know what a shopgirl's Saturday evening on a lit pier, timed against a third-class ticket, had actually been for. If you've made this walk, Brighton, Blackpool, Margate, anywhere the sea wall sorted an evening for you, tell us where and which train got you home. The next video follows the Wakes Week trains north, and what a fortnight, rather than an evening, organized for the families who took it. Ivy Marchant's Brighton is composite, built from real fares, real trains, real piers, real dates, because no single-named day tripper's diary survives the way a boarding house guest book sometimes does. But the promenade she is standing on is not composite. The West Pier is still standing in the water, in ruins, exactly where it was built. The Palace Pier is still lit at night, still louder than the quiet stretch toward Hove. The Brighton Belle's last run left Victoria on the 30th of April 1972, and nothing built since has replaced what that hour on the train was actually for. The walk is still free. Almost nothing else about that evening survived unchanged.